The war had lasted for over a decade, leaving both humanity and the Scifi Empire on the edge of collapse. Neither side had truly won, but neither could afford to keep fighting. In the end, peace was forced upon them by necessity, and a treaty was signed. But peace always came with a price. For the Scifi, a proud and battle-hardened species, the terms of the treaty were humiliating. One of the most controversial conditions was the biological integration program, a diplomatic strategy meant to ensure lasting unity. Select Scifi women were to be paired with human soldiers, forming bonds that would tie the two species together. To the Scifi, this was unthinkable. Valith, a warrior priestess of noble blood, sat stiffly inside a sterile human military compound, her sharp violet eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. Cold metal walls, blinking screens, and the hum of alien machines filled the air. Everything smelled strange. Too clean. Too controlled. Her long silver hair, braided in intricate warrior knots, marked her as a highborn among her people. But here, she was nothing more than a symbol of surrender. She clenched her fists. She had fought against humans in battle. Now she was expected to live among them. The very thought made her stomach turn. A door slid open with a quiet hiss. A human stepped inside. Valith narrowed her eyes. He was tall for his kind, broad-shouldered, with a sharp, disciplined gaze. His uniform was crisp, and the scars on his face spoke of experience. Commander Voss. This was the man she had been assigned to. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan crossed his arms. "You look like you want to kill me." Valith's expression didn't change. "Would you blame me?" Her voice was steady, but there was fire beneath it. Ethan let out a small breath, half amusement, half frustration. "You're not a prisoner. You weren't forced to come here." Valith's jaw tightened. "If I refused, my family would suffer the consequences." Ethan didn't deny it. Both sides had made sacrifices for peace, but he knew that for many Scifi, this was a deep betrayal. He studied her carefully. She wasn't afraid. She was furious. "I don't know what you've heard about humans," he said, "but I'm not here to control you. You don't have to like this arrangement, but you'll be treated with respect." Valith scoffed. "Respect? That word means nothing after what your people have done." Ethan held her gaze. "I could say the same about yours." A tense silence stretched between them. For the first time, Valith truly looked at him, not just as an enemy, but as an individual. There was no arrogance in his stance, no cruelty in his voice. His kind had won the war, yet he did not look at her with triumph. If anything, he looked tired. The war had taken its toll on both of them. Still, she refused to lower her guard. Ethan sighed. "I won't pretend this is easy, but neither of us had a choice in this." Valith straightened. "No, but I have a choice now. I will never bond with you. Do not expect submission." Ethan gave a small shrug. "Good. I prefer people who think for themselves." That response caught her off guard. She had expected arrogance, mockery, maybe even threats. Instead, she found something she had not expected from a human: patience. He stepped back toward the door. "You're free to explore the facility. You won't be locked up. But I suggest you don't pick a fight with every human you see." Valith crossed her arms. "And why not?" Ethan smirked. "Because some of them might actually win." Before she could respond, he was gone, leaving her alone in the quiet room. Valith exhaled sharply, forcing herself to remain calm. She had no intention of making this easy for him. If the humans thought she would break, they were wrong. But as she stared at the door he had walked through, she couldn't shake the feeling that this man was different from the others she had fought. And that unsettled her more than she was willing to admit. Valith had always believed humans were crude, impulsive creatures. She had fought them on the battlefield, seen their soldiers charge into danger without hesitation, and heard the stories of their unpredictable nature. And yet, the man she had been assigned to, Commander Voss, was nothing like the savage warrior she had imagined. He was calm. Too calm. For the past 2 days, Ethan had barely interacted with her. He did not bark orders or demand anything from her. Instead, he allowed her to move freely within the human military base. The lack of control unsettled her. Among the Scifi, warriors were always given strict roles, clear rules, and expectations. But here, there were none. She observed the humans carefully. They spoke in loud voices, laughed freely, and had an odd sense of humor. They were nothing like the disciplined, rigid society she had been raised in. The humans treated each other as equals. Even among soldiers, there was a strange sense of unity. Officers and lower-ranking warriors ate together, joked, and even argued, something that would never happen in the Scifi military. To her people, respect came from status and bloodline. Here, it seemed to be earned in other ways. Still, Valeth remained distant. She was not here to understand humans. She was here because she had no choice. But Ethan's patience was beginning to test her. That morning, she entered the training hall, a large open space filled with various weapons, combat dummies, and humans sparring with one another. The scent of sweat and metal filled the air. The sound of fists hitting targets echoed through the room. Ethan was there, practicing alone. His movements were precise, controlled. She had to admit, he was skilled. Not as fast as a Scifi warrior, but his strength and endurance were impressive. "You're just going to stand there and watch?" Ethan asked without turning. Valeth crossed her arms. "I am observing." Ethan smirked. "Then step in. Show me what Scifi training looks like." Her muscles tensed. A challenge. She had been waiting for this. Valeth stepped forward, removing the long ceremonial sash from her waist. The other human soldiers in the room paused to watch. She could hear their whispers. Some of them seemed excited, others uncertain. Ethan faced her, relaxed but ready. "Rules?" he asked. Valeth scoffed. "There are no rules in battle." Ethan chuckled. "All right, let's see what you've got." She moved first, fast as lightning. A strike aimed at his side, meant to test his reflexes. He dodged, barely. She followed with a sweeping kick, but he jumped back just in time. The humans watching let out small murmurs of surprise. Valeth pressed forward, increasing her speed. She expected Ethan to falter, but he adapted quickly. His strength allowed him to block where most would have fallen. He countered with a well-aimed strike to her side, which she narrowly avoided. The fight continued, a deadly dance of skill and instinct. Valeth was faster, but Ethan was relentless. Then, in a swift move, Ethan caught her wrist and twisted, just enough to shift her balance. She stumbled, just for a second, but it was enough. Before she could recover, he spun her around and locked her arms behind her back, pinning her. The watching soldiers gasped. Valeth struggled, but his grip was like iron. Ethan leaned slightly closer. "Still think humans are weak?" he asked, voice steady. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. She was furious, not because she had lost, but because, for the first time, a human had matched her. She growled lowly, "Release me." Ethan let go immediately and took a step back, showing no sign of arrogance. No mockery, just respect. Valeth turned to face him, breathing heavily. The watching humans broke into applause and laughter, clearly impressed. She clenched her fists. This was not what she had expected. This human was not what she had expected. Ethan simply gave her a nod. "You fight well. Let's do it again sometime." Without another word, he picked up his towel, wiped the sweat from his brow, and walked away as if nothing had happened. Valeth stood frozen, watching him go. For the first time in her life, she felt something strange, a feeling she could not name. Perhaps humans were not as weak as she thought. Valeth could not stop thinking about the fight. For years, she had trained with the finest Scifi warriors, mastering the art of combat. No human should have been able to keep up with her. Yet Ethan had not only matched her, He had restrained her. The idea of a human overpowering her was frustrating. She told herself it was a moment of weakness, an accident. Next time, she would not allow him to gain the upper hand. But what troubled her more was Ethan's reaction. He had not gloated, not laughed at her. He had simply walked away, as if their fight meant nothing. Among her people, victory was something to be celebrated. For humans, it seemed different. The next morning, she found herself outside the training hall again. She had no reason to be there, yet her feet had led her back. Inside, human soldiers were lifting heavy weights, running drills, and sparring with one another. Their discipline was unusual. They pushed themselves hard, beyond their limits, despite their weaker bodies. Her people had always said that humans lacked strength, but Valeth was beginning to realize something. Humans created their strength. Looking for a rematch, she turned to see Ethan approaching, dressed in a simple workout uniform, sweat already on his brow. He had likely been training for hours. Valeth crossed her arms. "You were lucky yesterday." Ethan smirked. "I don't believe in luck." She studied him carefully. He was relaxed, yet there was something unreadable in his gaze. He did not see her as an enemy, not even as a rival. That annoyed her. "You fight well," she admitted, "for a human." Ethan chuckled. That almost sounded like a compliment. Valeth huffed. "I wish to understand. How did you develop such skill?" Ethan grabbed a towel and wiped his hands. "Training, discipline, experience." He looked at her. "Same as you, I imagine." She narrowed her eyes. "No, not the same. Humans are weaker, slower, yet you fight as if you are equal." Ethan's smirk faded. He became serious. "Because we have to." His words made her pause. Ethan sat down on a nearby bench and gestured for her to do the same. After a moment, she reluctantly joined him. "You want to know why humans fight the way we do?" Ethan asked. Valeth nodded. Ethan took a deep breath. "Because we don't have the natural advantages other species do. We're not the strongest, not the fastest. We don't have claws, or thick hides, or superior genetics. All we have is our will." He clenched his fists. "When we go to war, we know we're at a disadvantage. We know we're fighting against creatures that are bigger, stronger, more advanced. But we fight anyway. We adapt, we learn, we refuse to give up." Valeth listened carefully. Ethan turned to her. "You Scifi are born warriors. Fighting is in your blood. But for humans, it's different. We become warriors. We struggle, we suffer, we grow. That's what makes us dangerous." His words struck something deep inside her. For her people, strength was a birthright. The weak were discarded. But humans made themselves strong. A strange feeling stirred in her chest. Was this why humans were so unpredictable, so hard to defeat? Ethan stood up. "If you really want to understand, then train with us." Valeth raised an eyebrow. "You want me to train as a human?" Ethan grinned. "Afraid you won't keep up." She bristled. "I accept." Ethan nodded. "Then let's begin." For the next few hours, Valeth followed the human soldiers through their grueling exercises, lifting weights, running long distances, performing push-ups and pull-ups. At first, she scoffed at their training. It was primitive compared to Scifi combat drills. But as time passed, she began to understand. Humans did not just train their bodies, they trained their minds. They pushed through exhaustion, through pain. Even when their bodies begged for rest, they kept going. Sweat dripped down her skin as she completed another round of push-ups. Her muscles ached, not from strain, but from the sheer repetition. She glanced at Ethan. He was breathing heavily, but he kept moving. So did the other soldiers. No one gave up. As she collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath, Ethan crouched beside her, offering a bottle of water. She took it without hesitation. "Not bad," Ethan said with a small smile. "For Scifi." Valeth let out a breathless chuckle. For the first time, she understood. Strength was not just about power. Strength was endurance, willpower, the refusal to break. And humans were stronger than she had ever imagined. Valith had never felt this kind of exhaustion before. The Scifi trained their bodies to be strong, swift, and deadly. But human training was different. It wasn't about raw power, it was about endurance, about breaking limits again and again. Her muscles ached from the drills, but she refused to stop. She couldn't. Not when the humans around her kept pushing forward, their faces drenched in sweat, but filled with determination. Not when Ethan, the human soldier who had defeated her, kept moving as if fatigue was just another enemy to conquer. As she struggled through another set of push-ups, Ethan crouched beside her, arms resting on his knees. "You're keeping up better than I expected," he said with a small grin. Valith exhaled sharply. "I do not need your approval." Ethan chuckled. "Oh, I know. But you're starting to see it, aren't you?" She paused, staring at him. "See what?" Ethan gestured to the soldiers around them. Some were barely standing, their bodies pushed past their limits, but still, they continued. "Why we fight the way we do," he said. "Why we train like this." Valith sat back on her knees, catching her breath. She had thought humans were reckless, that they threw themselves into battle without reason. But now she realized the truth. Humans weren't reckless. They were relentless. Every drop of sweat, every exhausted breath, they weren't just training their bodies. They were forging their will. Valith let out a slow breath. "I understand." Ethan smirked. "Good, because we're just getting started." For the next few days, Valith trained alongside the human soldiers. She ran with them, lifted weights with them, fought in their sparring matches. At first, she had thought their methods were strange, but now she found herself respecting them. She wasn't the only one changing. The human soldiers, once wary of her, began to accept her as one of their own. They laughed with her, challenged her, treated her like a comrade instead of an outsider. For the first time, she felt welcome. Even Ethan, who had once been just a rival in her eyes, was becoming something else, a friend. One night, after a long day of training, Valith stood outside, staring at the stars. She heard footsteps behind her. "Ethan, you're thinking about something," he said, standing beside her. Valith sighed. "Humans are not what I expected." Ethan smirked. "What did you expect?" She hesitated. "Weakness." Ethan chuckled. "Well, we're full of surprises." She turned to him. "My people believe strength is something you are born with. But humans, you create your own strength." Ethan nodded. "We have no choice. The universe isn't kind to us." Valith thought about that. The Scifi saw themselves as superior warriors, yet humans had fought them to a standstill. Why? Because humans never stopped fighting. Valith clenched her fists. She wanted that strength, not just the kind she was born with, but the kind that came from willpower. She looked at Ethan, determination in her eyes. "Teach me." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Teach you what?" Valith stepped closer. "Not just how to fight. Teach me how to think like a human warrior." Ethan studied her for a long moment. Then he grinned. "All right," he said. "But be warned, this won't be easy." Valith smirked. "Good. I do not want it to be easy." For the first time in her life, she wanted to be more than just a Scifi warrior. She wanted to be strong, the human way. And she would not stop until she was. She had trained for days with the human soldiers, pushing her body beyond its limits. Every muscle ached, every breath felt heavy, but she refused to stop. The Scifi warriors believed strength was something you were born with. But humans, they built their strength. And Valith wanted that. She needed that. She stood in the training yard at dawn, the air crisp and cool. The other soldiers were just waking up, but she had already been here for an hour, practicing the human way. Repetition, endurance, discipline. Ethan walked up beside her, arms crossed. You're up early. Valeth didn't stop. I will not fall behind. Ethan smirked. You're not behind. You're ahead of most of the guys. She turned to him, sweat dripping from her brow. Then I must train harder. Ethan chuckled. You remind me of the new recruits, the stubborn ones. She frowned. Is that bad? He shook his head. No, that's how the best soldiers are made. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Only the sound of distant voices and boots on the ground filled the air. Then Ethan gestured toward a pile of weighted gear. All right, if you're so determined, let's see how you handle a real challenge. The challenge was brutal. Ethan had strapped extra weights onto her arms and legs and ordered her to do an obstacle course designed for elite human soldiers. Valeth ran, jumped, crawled through the dirt. She slipped, fell, got back up. The weights dragged her down. Her muscles screamed in protest, but she refused to stop. Ethan watched from a distance, arms crossed. A few other soldiers had gathered to watch, whispering among themselves. She's tough, one of them muttered. Yeah, another agreed. She's got heart. Valeth didn't care what they said. She only focused on finishing. One final wall. She leaped, her fingers gripping the edge. Her arms burned. The weight threatened to pull her back. But she clenched her teeth and pulled herself up. When she landed on the other side, Ethan clapped his hands. That's what I'm talking about. Valeth collapsed to one knee, gasping for air. Ethan crouched beside her. How do you feel? She looked up at him, her breathing ragged. And then, despite the pain, she smiled. Stronger. That night, as she sat by the fire with the human soldiers, something felt different. She wasn't just an outsider anymore. She was one of them. They laughed with her, shared stories of battles and victories. Even Ethan, who had once been only a rival, had become someone she could trust. A friend. At one point, a soldier nudged Ethan. You think she's ready for a real mission? Valeth raised an eyebrow. A mission? Ethan glanced at her, then smirked. Maybe. She straightened. I am ready. Ethan studied her for a long moment, then nodded. All right, he said. Tomorrow, you're coming with us. Valeth's heart pounded. This was it. She had trained. She had pushed herself beyond what she thought possible. Now, it was time to prove herself, not as a Scifi warrior, as a soldier, as a fighter in the human way. And she wouldn't let them down. Valeth stood at the edge of the battlefield, her heart pounding. This was no longer training. This was real. The mission was simple, at least on paper. A human reconnaissance team had gone missing while scouting enemy-controlled territory. Ethan and his squad had been assigned to investigate. Valeth was going with them, her first real battle alongside humans. She clenched her fists, steadying herself as the dropship hummed beneath her feet. Soldiers around her checked their weapons, tightened their armor, and prepared for what was coming. Ethan stood beside her, adjusting his rifle. Nervous? Valeth exhaled. No. He raised an eyebrow. Maybe a little, she admitted. Ethan smirked. Good. That means you're ready. The ship's red lights flickered. The pilot's voice came over the comms. Landing in 30 seconds. Valeth took a deep breath. The door slid open, revealing the dark, smoke-covered jungle below. Move out, Ethan commanded. And they jumped. The jungle was silent. Too silent. The team moved carefully, their boots sinking into damp soil. Valeth's sharp eyes scanned the trees, her muscles tense. Something was wrong. Where's the enemy? One of the soldiers muttered. Ethan frowned. Stay alert. This feels like an ambush. They reached the last known location of the missing reconnaissance team. The sight made Valeth's stomach twist. Wreckage, burned equipment, and the remains of a battle. No bodies, she said. Ethan nodded, which means they were taken. A branch snapped. Valeth turned instantly, her blade in hand. A shadow moved. Then, gunfire. The enemy struck fast, emerging from the jungle like ghosts. Plasma bolts and bullets tore through the air. Valeth reacted on instinct, rolling behind cover as explosions lit up the night. She heard the sharp commands of human soldiers, the cries of battle. A hostile charged toward her, taller than a human, armored in dark plating. Valeth moved. She ducked under its swing, drove her blade upward, piercing its weak point. The alien fell with a gurgling cry. More came. She fought like the humans, quick, precise, ruthless. But there were too many. "We need to fall back," a soldier shouted. "No," Ethan growled. "We push forward. Valeth with me." She didn't hesitate. They cut through the enemy ranks, moving as one. Ethan covered her from a distance, his rifle picking off threats. Valeth fought up close, slicing through armor, dodging blows with inhuman reflexes. Then she saw it, a prison cage, half hidden in the jungle. The missing humans were inside, weak but alive. "We found them," she shouted. Ethan saw it too. "Cover us," he ordered. Bullets and plasma fire rained down as they rushed to the prisoners. Valeth grabbed the cage's lock and ripped it apart with raw strength. "Move," she urged. The freed soldiers scrambled out, grabbing weapons from fallen enemies. Now, they were fighting too. Hope surged through Valeth. They could win. They would win. The battle rage. But now, with the missing soldiers back in the fight, the tide was turning. Ethan's voice cut through the chaos. "Valeth, on your left." She spun, too late. An enemy struck, its blade slicing across her side. Pain flared, hot and sharp. She staggered. Ethan's rifle roared, dropping her attacker before it could finish her. "Valeth." He ran to her side. "Stay with me." She clenched her teeth, pushing through the pain. "I can still fight." He grinned. I'd expect nothing less. With one final push, they drove the enemy back. Victory. As the sun rose, the battlefield fell silent. Smoke curled into the sky. The mission was complete. Valeth sat on a rock, pressing a bandage against her wound. Ethan dropped down beside her, handing her a canteen. "Not bad for your first mission," he said. She took a sip of water, exhaling slowly. "I could have done better." He chuckled. "You saved lives today. That's what matters." Valeth looked at the rescued soldiers, now reunited with their comrades. She had fought alongside humans, blood with them, earned her place among them, and for the first time in her life, she felt like she belonged. But the war wasn't over yet, and she knew the biggest battle was still ahead. The battlefield was silent now, but Valeth knew it wouldn't last. She sat inside the human base, her side still aching from the wound she had taken. The medics had treated it, but she refused to rest. There was no time. Across the room, Ethan stood over a strategy table, his expression serious. The mission had been a success. They had rescued the missing soldiers. But the enemy wouldn't let this slide. A counterattack was coming. "They'll strike at dawn," Ethan said, turning to the team. "We barely have time to reinforce the perimeter." Valeth stepped forward. "Then we make every second count." Ethan met her gaze. He saw the fire in her eyes. She wasn't just a warrior anymore. She was one of them. He nodded. "All right, let's get to work." Before sunrise, the battle began. The enemy came in waves, their forces swarming the human outpost. The jungle trembled under the sounds of war, gunfire, explosions, the clash of steel. Valeth stood at the front lines. She fought not just for survival, but for something more. For the humans who had accepted her. For the people who had become her family. A massive enemy warrior charged at her, its weapon raised. Valeth didn't hesitate. She dodged, spinning behind it, and drove her blade deep into its back. It fell with a heavy thud, but more took its place. Ethan was beside her, firing shot after shot. "We're getting overrun." A soldier yelled from the tower, "They're bringing heavy artillery." Velith's eyes narrowed. If the enemy got those weapons into position, the base would be destroyed. "We need to take out those cannons," she said. Ethan glanced at her. "That's suicide." Velith smirked. "Then I will not go alone." He let out a breath, then nodded. "Let's move." The enemy cannons were positioned on a ridge, guarded by elite warriors. Velith and a small team, led by Ethan, moved through the jungle, staying low. Every second counted. When they reached the ridge, Ethan whispered, "We hit hard and fast." Velith tightened her grip on her weapon. "Understood." Then they struck. Velith leaped forward, slicing through the first guard before he could react. Ethan and the others opened fire, cutting down the enemies with precise shots. The cannons powered up, their barrels glowing with energy. Velith's heart pounded. They were running out of time. "Cover me," she shouted. She dashed toward the largest cannon, climbing onto its structure. Enemy warriors rushed to stop her, but she was too fast. She reached the core, raised her blade, and plunged it deep. The cannon exploded in a shower of sparks. One down. She jumped away just as Ethan destroyed the second cannon with a well-placed grenade. The enemy's advantage was gone. Now the humans had a chance. Back at the base, the tide was turning. With the cannons destroyed, the human soldiers fought with renewed strength. The enemy, realizing their defeat, began to retreat. Velith stood beside Ethan, breathing heavily. "We did it," he said. She nodded, scanning the battlefield. The enemy was pulling back, their forces broken. The battle was over. They had won. As the sun rose, the soldiers cheered. The base still stood. The humans had survived. Velith looked around at the people she had fought beside, the people she had bullied for. She had spent her whole life believing that strength was something you were born with, that warriors were chosen, not made. But humans had taught her something different. Strength was earned. Through struggle, through pain, through standing back up, no matter how many times you fell. Ethan walked up beside her. "You thinking about leaving?" She looked at him, surprised. "No." A small smile formed on her lips. "I'm staying." Ethan smirked. "Good. We could use someone like you." Velith turned back to the sunrise. She had come to fear humans. Now she fought for them, and she wouldn't have it any other way.